The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and fallen leaves. Inside the dimly lit police station, Officer Jake Carter leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. It had been an unusually quiet evening. No break-ins, no bar fights, not even a noise complaint. The kind of night every cop hoped for but rarely got. He glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Just a little longer before his shift ended. He reached for his cup of coffee, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip. The warmth did little to chase away the fatigue settling in his bones. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic scratching against the glass doors at the front of the station. Soft at first, then more insistent. Jake frowned, setting his coffee down. Probably the wind, he thought. The autumn breeze had been rattling everything all evening. But then it came again. Scratch, 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 accompanied by a low, desperate whine. His cop instincts kicked in. Standing, he adjusted his belt and walked toward the entrance. As he neared the glass doors, his pulse quickened. He expected a stray cat, maybe a raccoon scavenging for food. What he saw instead made him freeze. A dog, a German shepherd covered in dirt and shivering from exhaustion, stood outside, staring straight at him. Its big brown eyes, illuminated by the fluorescent lights inside the station, weren't just looking at him. They were pleading. The dog's fur was matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath a layer of grime. It wasn't just lost. It wasn't just hungry. It needed help. Jake hesitated only a second before unlocking the door and pulling it open. A rush of cold air hit him, but the dog didn't move. It stood firm, panting heavily, ears perked forward as if waiting for something. "Hey there, buddy," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. "What's going on?" The dog whined again, stepping forward slightly, then backing up. It repeated the motion twice before letting out a frustrated bark. Jake had worked with K-9 units before. He had seen trained dogs signal to their handlers, lead them toward danger, or alert them to something wrong. This wasn't just a random stray. This dog was trying to tell him something. Curiosity flickered in his chest, quickly followed by concern. He crouched down, extending a hand. The dog sniffed it hesitantly, but didn't waste time with greetings. Instead, it turned sharply, ran a few steps away, then stopped and looked back. It was waiting. Jake straightened, his heartbeat picking up. He'd seen this before in trained police dogs, but this one? It didn't have a collar. No ID tags, no sign of being part of any force. Still, something in his gut told him to listen. All right, he muttered, grabbing his jacket and radio. "I'm coming." The dog didn't hesitate. It bolted forward into the dark, only pausing to make sure Jake was following. And as he stepped onto the empty street, the quiet of the night no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm. Jake followed the dog down the dimly lit street, his boots echoing against the wet pavement. The German shepherd moved with urgency, glancing back every few steps to make sure he was still there. Its paws left faint imprints in the thin layer of damp leaves that scattered the sidewalk. A sense of unease settled in Jake's chest. He had responded to plenty of strange calls in his years as a cop, but this was different. This wasn't a distressed owner looking for a lost pet. This dog was on a mission. As they passed darkened storefronts and empty alleys, Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Was someone hurt? A crime scene? Maybe an abandoned owner? The air grew colder, and Jake tightened his grip on his radio. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced with each gust of wind. The dog suddenly stopped at an intersection, its ears twitching, nose flaring. It let out a low, frustrated whimper, before taking off again, this time at a faster pace. "Whoa, slow down, buddy," Jake called, quickening his steps. But the dog wasn't waiting anymore. Jake jogged after it, his heart pounding harder. They were heading into an older part of town, one filled with abandoned warehouses and forgotten buildings, a place where no one would hear you if you screamed. The dog darted down a narrow alley, its paws splashing through a shallow puddle. Jake hesitated for only a second before stepping in after it. The scent of damp concrete and old garbage filled the air. His fingers hovered over the holster of his service weapon just in case. Then he saw it. A man lay crumpled against the wall at the end of the alley. His clothes were torn, his face pale under the dim streetlight. He wasn't moving. Jake rushed forward, dropping to one knee. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His lips slightly parted as if trying to speak. Blood stained his sleeve, and bruises covered his knuckles. A fight? An accident? Either way, he needed medical attention. Jake reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need an ambulance at—" A weak hand grabbed his wrist. Jake froze, looking down. The man's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. His lips moved, but the sound that came out was barely above a whisper. "Help." The dog whined and pressed its nose against the man's arm, licking at his wounds. Jake swallowed hard, his training kicking in. "You're going to be okay," he said firmly. "Stay with me." As he relayed the location to dispatch, the dog sat protectively by the man's side, ears alert, watching Jake's every move. It had been running for him. The alley was silent, save for the distant hum of the city beyond. Officer Jake Carter crouched beside the unconscious man, his pulse racing. The German Shepherd, now still for the first time since arriving at the station, sat close by, its brown eyes locked onto Jake, as if waiting for him to act. Jake pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, weak but there. His breathing was shallow, uneven. The bruises on his face and the blood on his sleeve told a story Jake hadn't figured out yet. Reaching for his radio, Jake called it in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I have a male, mid-30s, unconscious but breathing. Possible assault victim. Requesting immediate medical assistance at the alley behind 5th and Main." The dispatcher responded, confirming an ambulance was en route. Jake exhaled, shifting his focus back to the man. He noticed something strange. His fingers were curled into a loose fist, gripping something. Carefully, Jake pried them open and found a torn scrap of paper smeared with dirt. It had only 2 words, hastily scribbled, "Help me." His stomach clenched. This wasn't just a random accident. Someone had left this man here, possibly to die. The dog let out a soft whimper, nudging the man's hand with its nose. Jake watched the way the dog's ears flattened, its body leaning protectively against him. This wasn't just any dog. This was his dog. Jake reached out, scratching behind the shepherd's ear. "You led me to him, didn't you?" The dog let out a short breath, almost as if sighing in relief. A soft groan came from the man's lips. Jake leaned in closer. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" The man's eyelids flickered, and for a moment, Jake caught a glimpse of tired, pain-filled eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Jake pulled out a small bottle of water from his utility belt, unscrewed the cap, and carefully poured a few drops onto the man's lips. The reaction was immediate. He swallowed, then let out a hoarse cough. The dog perked up, tail wagging slightly as it leaned closer. Jake gave the man another sip before speaking again. "You're safe now. Help is coming. Can you tell me your name?" A pause, Then, a weak whisper, "Daniel." Jake nodded. "Okay, Daniel. Do you know what happened to you?" Daniel winced as if trying to recall the events. His hand instinctively reached out, gripping the dog's fur weakly. They took her." Jake's brows furrowed. "Took who?" Daniel's eyes squeezed shut. His breath hitched as if saying it out loud made it real. "My daughter." A cold chill ran down Jake's spine. This wasn't just an assault. This was something much worse. He felt the urgency in the shepherd's behavior now more than ever. The dog hadn't just been looking for help. It had been looking for someone who would listen. Jake's grip tightened on his radio. "Dispatch. We may have a possible kidnapping situation. I need additional units at my location, ASAP." The dog let out a short bark, its tail wagging once before pressing itself against Daniel's side. The man's fingers curled deeper into its fur, holding on like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Jake exhaled, looking down at the two of them. He wasn't just dealing with a victim anymore. He was dealing with a father, and time was running out. The paramedics arrived in record time, their red and blue lights flashing against the dark alley walls. Jake stepped back as they assessed Daniel, speaking in quiet, urgent tones. The German shepherd stayed put, sitting loyally beside the injured man, ears twitching with every movement. It was clear. This dog wasn't just a pet. It was family. As they lifted Daniel onto the stretcher, the shepherd whined and tried to jump up with him. Jake instinctively placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying it. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "They're gonna take care of him." The dog didn't move. Its eyes remained locked on Daniel, as if letting him out of sight would mean losing him forever. One of the paramedics turned to Jake. "You coming with us, officer?" Jake hesitated, then glanced down at the shepherd. The dog was still watching Daniel, unmoving, waiting for a command that would never come. Jake sighed. "I'll meet you there." The ambulance doors shut with a heavy clang, and within seconds it was gone, sirens fading into the distance. The shepherd let out a low, mournful whimper, staring at the now empty space where the ambulance had been. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. He had dealt with dogs before. K-9 units, strays, rescue animals. But this was different. This dog wasn't trained for police work, but its instincts, its loyalty, were something else entirely. "You don't have anywhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. The shepherd turned to him then, its deep brown eyes filled with something Jake recognized. Not just loyalty. Trust. Jake sighed again, shaking his head. "All right," he muttered. "Guess you're coming with me." Back at his small apartment, Jake opened the door and let the dog inside. The place was nothing fancy, just a couch, a small kitchen, and a TV that barely worked. He tossed his keys on the counter and turned to see the dog standing in the doorway, hesitating. "Come on in," Jake said, motioning with his hand. The shepherd took a slow step forward, then another, sniffing the air as it entered. It was alert, cautious. Jake could tell this wasn't a dog used to being inside a home. He grabbed a bowl, filled it with water, and set it on the floor. Then he pulled some leftover chicken from the fridge, placing it in another dish. "Here," he said. "Figured you'd be hungry." The dog sniffed at the food, hesitating before finally lowering its head to eat. The way it chewed slowly, as if not used to regular meals, made Jake's chest tighten. Jake sat down on the couch, watching the shepherd. It was a beautiful dog, even under the dirt and exhaustion. Strong building, intelligent eyes. But there was something else, a sadness, a weight that Jake recognized all too well. He ran a hand over his face and exhaled. "Daniel said they took his daughter," he murmured. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "That means someone's out there with a kid who needs help. And we don't know who or why." The shepherd lifted its head slightly, ears flicking as if it understood. Jake glanced at the dog. "You're not just any dog, are you?" The shepherd didn't move, just watched him with intelligent, knowing eyes. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, to Jake's surprise, the dog slowly stood up and walked over. It sat right in front of him, resting its head gently on his knee. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed that quiet understanding, that presence. He slowly reached out, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "You miss him, don't you?" he whispered. The shepherd let out a soft huff, pressing closer. Jake felt something shift inside him. He had spent years believing in loyalty, in duty, in doing what was right. But this was something different, something deeper. This dog had risked everything to find help. It had refused to give up, refused to leave its owner behind. And now, with Daniel in the hospital, it had no one, except Jake. Jake let out a slow breath. "We're gonna find her," he said, more to himself than to the dog. "Daniel's daughter. We're not letting this end here." The shepherd's tail thumped softly against the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The weight of everything pressed down on him. A man left for dead, a missing child, and a dog that had somehow known exactly where to go for help. For years, Jake had thought he'd seen it all, thought he understood how the world worked. But tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just a cop doing his job. He was part of something bigger. He looked down at the shepherd again. "We're not done, are we?" The dog slowly sat up, tail wagging once. Jake nodded. "All right, then." For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Hope.